Hello my dear students. So in this lesson we were discussing reproduction of man, and in the previous chapter I discussed the reproductive system of females. So today I am going to discuss the female reproductive system. So in that, first we will look at the main parts of the female reproductive system. So when we say the main parts, one of the main parts is ovary. So here you can see ovary. Now if you look at the ovary, students, it's like a oval shaped structure and it has two main parts, the cortex and medulla. So here you can see this outer region is what we call as cortex, and in the middle it's actually the medulla. And in this outer region, if you look at the ovary, there are follicles, small sac-like structures with fluid in it, and inside that there are ovum, or the egg develops inside those follicles. And when a female child is born itself, in the fetal stage itself, all these primary follicles are present in an ovary. You all can remember these, students. In males, the reproductive function starts after the puberty or adolescence. But in females, when the child is born itself, the primary follicles are present. But the function starts after the adolescence. You all have to remember that. So the structure, follicles, everything is already there. So if we look at ovary, there is a pair of ovaries closest to the lateral walls of pelvic area in the abdominal cavity. So there are two ovaries in a female and it is inside the abdominal cavity, what we normally call as the stomach area, the abdominal cavity, and that is closer to the lateral walls, the sides of the person. Lateral means the side walls. So the ovaries are closer to the side walls of the pelvic area. You all know where the legs are. The legs normally join with the pelvic girdle. That area below the abdomen and between the legs is known as the pelvic area. So near the lateral walls of the pelvic area, there are the two ovaries. Is that okay, students? So there is a pair of ovaries close to the lateral walls of the pelvic area in the abdominal cavity. And in a cross section of an ovary, there are two zones known as cortex and medulla. So I have shown you all that. Ovary is a structure like this, somewhat oval shaped. It's not an exact oval shape, somewhat similar to that. And in that you have the outer region cortex and the middle region medulla. And ova are produced in follicles. Ova is the female gamete cell. Ovum is singular, ova means plural. So many ova are produced inside this ovary and they are produced inside follicles. So I told you all there are small sac-like structures like that we call as the primary follicles, and these follicles undergo development after adolescence. So there they will exist in different stages. For example, we can consider the Graafian follicle, corpus luteum, corpus albicans. All those are different stages of the follicles. So each ovary contains primary follicles. You have to remember that. Primary follicles and various stages of production of ova such as Graafian follicles, corpus luteum and corpus albicans. Is that okay, students? So there are follicles, as I told you, small sac-like structures at different developmental stages. Primary follicles are the follicles that are there when the fetus develops itself. Thereafter, after adolescence, they undergo changes forming the Graafian follicle, corpus luteum and corpus albicans. Production of ova starts at the birth of a female. So I told you all this. Production of ova starts at the birth of the female itself. This is different from the males. So but the cycle, the menstruation, all the processes occur after adolescence. But the production of ova, because the primary follicles are already there. Is that clear to you all, students? So with that, I will move on to the next structure, that is fallopian tube. Now, if we take the ovaries, in addition to the ovaries, one of the main structures is the uterus. So, if we take a uterus, it is a funnel-like structure like this, and at the two ends of the uterus, you get a tube-like structure. This tube-like structure is what we call as fallopian tube. Fallopian tube. And at the end of the fallopian tube, there is again a funnel-like structure with finger-like projections. And these finger-like projections are known as fimbria. With the movement of the fimbria only, the ovum will be directed into the fallopian tube. When I show you all the diagram, you will see, students, the ovary is connected like this. From this only, when the Graafian follicle ruptures, the ovum will come out. So, at the same time, the fimbria will move. So, with that movement, the ovum will be directed into the fallopian tube. So, ovum that comes out of the ovary enters into long muscular tube called fallopian tube. So, here you can see this is a long muscular tube. Since there are two ovaries on either side of the uterus, on either side we have the fallopian tube with the fimbria. The end of this tube, which is close to the ovary, is funnel-like and has finger-like projections called fimbria. So, that is part of the fallopian tube. These are important in transferring the ovum into fallopian tube. So, I explained that process to you. With that, I will move on to the next structure. So, the next structure is uterus. Normally, we call it the womb. This is the structure in which the fetus develops. So, if we look at the structure, this is a hollow structure positioned in pelvic area. So, why do we call it hollow? Hollow means it's like a sac-like or bag-like structure. It can expand as well. When I showed you all the structure of the fallopian tube, I drew the part of the uterus. So, this is something like that. And here we have the fallopian tubes with the fimbria. So, this part is what we call as the uterus. So, here is where the child develops or the fetus develops. And this uterus has walls. If you look at it, it has walls like that. So, these and also the uterus is made up of three parts. Now, this upper part is called the fundus. And the middle part is the body. And below region, we have the cervix. And the cervix actually opens into the vagina. Through the vagina only, the sperms will enter into the uterus, and from there, it will move towards the fallopian tube. At the same time, the ovum from the ovary will come through the fallopian tube. So, they can meet in the middle of the fallopian tube and fertilization can take place. So, that is the structure of a uterus. So, inside there is space. That is why we call it a hollow structure positioned in the pelvic area. Again, I told you all, students, what a pelvic area is. It is below the abdomen between the legs. That is the pelvic area. There are three zones in uterus named fundus, body and cervix. So, I have shown you all the three parts. Two fallopian tubes are connected to the zone called fundus. So, here you can see the fallopian tubes are connected to the fundus. And you can remember the ovaries are connected to the body with a small stem-like structure. The two ovaries are connected on either side. And the other end of the uterus is cervix. So, this side is the cervix. This will actually continue as the vagina. Is that clear to you? So, that is the structure inside which the fetus develops. So, with that, I will move on to the next slide. Vagina or endocervical canal. As I showed you all in the previous diagram, from the cervix to the vulva. Vulva is the opening of the female reproductive structure that opens into the outer environment. So, there it opens through the vagina. So, cervix, after that vagina, that has the opening vulva. Vagina starts from the cervix and opens to the exterior from the opening called vulva. So, that is the opening. And here students, when we look at the diagram, you will be able to see, unlike in the male reproductive structure, in female reproductive system, normally the females have the urinary opening, that is the urethra. Then there is the vagina which opens with the vulva and the separate anus. But in males, you can remember students, the urethra is the one that is common to both the reproductive system as well as the urinary system. So, here there are different openings. So, vagina starts from the cervix and opens to the exterior from the opening called vulva. And this vagina is also known as endocervical canal. Why? From the cervix to the vulva, it acts as a small canal. So, that is why we call it as endocervical canal. With that, I will move on to the next slide. So, this is the structure of the female reproductive system. So, if we label the different parts. Now, here you can see these students, this structure that you can identify like a funnel-like structure, and this is actually the uterus, a hollow muscular structure. From that you can see it is coming to one side and with the fimbria. So, what is that? That is the fallopian tube. So, the first structure is the fallopian tube. This side is the fallopian tube. Then here you all can see like an oval shaped structure. I told you all what that is. Here also students, you all can see it's connected to the uterus, the body of the uterus. So, that is the ovary. There are two ovaries, a pair of ovaries. So, that is going to be the ovary. Then here I told you all the hollow structure, that is the uterus, or what we normally call as the womb, uterus. Then what is this? This is part of the urinary system or the excretory system, that is the urinary bladder, or what we can just write as the bladder. So, here you can see students, the bladder opens into the external environment or exterior through the urethra, that is the urethra. So, that is a separate opening, whereas here you can see this particular structure, that is the vulva. This is different. Here you can see from the uterus, now we have the vagina here and the opening is the vulva. Then on this side, if we look at this structure, from the uterus, the structure, here you can see this is the fundus, this is the body part. Then here we have the cervix, and cervix extends as the endocervical canal or the vagina. You can remember that. So, this is the vagina or endocervical canal that opens to the exterior via the vulva. So, I am sure students, you can label all these parts if you are given the diagram. So, this is the location of female reproductive system in a female body. It's present in the pelvic region, that is below the abdomen between the legs. So, the main parts uterus, vulva, vagina and the fallopian tubes as well as the ovaries. So, with that I will move on to the next slide. Here again we have the female reproductive system. All the parts are given in detail. So, here again you can look at the structures. Here you can see students, this is the ovary and ovary is connected to the uterus. Here you can see from the fundus of the uterus, the fallopian tube extends, and here it has the funnel-like structure at the end, and here you can see the finger-like projections, the fimbria. So then again, inside if you look at the uterus, the fundus, body and the cervix part, and it extends into form the vagina, and here you can see this is a muscular wall. So that is the wall of the uterus, and inside we have the cavity of the uterus, or we can call it as the uterine cavity, uterine wall. So if we label the parts, this one in the middle is the cavity of the uterus. Cavity of uterus. Then we have the wall of uterus. Then on the other side, here we have the fallopian tube. Fallopian tube. And here you can see these are the fimbria, the finger-like projections. And what is this? It is the ovary. Ovary, you all can see the different structures, the different stages of developing follicles. So, ovary. So, here you can see the smallest ones are the primary follicles, then they develop, then they form the Graafian follicle. After that, it becomes the corpus luteum and corpus albicans. And on this side, you can see this is the uterus. So, uterus, uterus wall and the cavity of uterus, everything together is the uterus. So, here we have the cervix, and here we have the vagina. And if you are to mark the fundus here, it will be there, fundus, and this part will be the body. So here it will be the body. Body is where we have marked the cavity and the wall. So there, I am sure students, you all know the parts of the female reproductive system. If you are given the diagram, you should be able to label them. The cavity of uterus, wall of uterus, then the upper part is the fundus. From the fundus, it is the fallopian tube extending to both sides. And you also can see there are two ovaries. They are connected to the fundus of the uterus. And here, of course, they have shown the structure of the ovary. It is again a cross section. So, inside that you can see the different follicles, different stages of follicles. And here is the fimbria of the fallopian tube. And then we have the uterus. Here we have the cervix and the vagina. So, fundus is the upper part, middle part is the body, and then we have the cervix that extends into the vagina. And also you all know opening of the vagina is what we call as the vulva. So, those are the parts of the female reproductive system. For the cavity of uterus, we can also call it as the lumen of uterus. So, we can either say cavity or lumen. Lumen of uterus. So, that is the inside part inside which the fetus will develop. So, these are the parts of the female reproductive structure. With that, students, I will move on to the next slide. Functions of female reproductive system. So, when we say the functions of the female reproductive system, now we saw there are two main structures, the uterus inside which the fetus develops and the ovary where the ova is formed. Ovum is developed. So, these two main structures have the two main functions. In addition to that, the fallopian tube, fimbria, all that participate in the function. So, if we look at the female reproductive structure, the functions, two main functions producing ovum, ovum I said is singular and ova is the plural, and also the development of the fetus. So, if we look at the functions, production of ova in females initiates since fetal stage. I have explained that also before. So, production of ova actually initiates in the fetal stage. You all know what a fetal stage is. The stage in which the baby is still developing inside the mother's uterus. So that is the fetal stage. So then itself there are primary follicles produced. At birth, each ovary contains 200,000 to 400,000 primary follicles. So at birth itself, there are the fixed number of follicles. So there are 2 ovaries. Inside the ovaries, there are primary follicles, and there are about 200,000 to 400,000 primary follicles. That is why, students, in females, adolescence starts and the menstrual cycle stops at the stage that is known as the menopause. Within that period, the primary follicles will undergo changes, developing and releasing ova. So that is why there is a certain period between adolescence and menopause, because the number of primary follicles are already there in birth itself. Nearing puberty, one of the primary follicles develops to form a multicellular structure called Graafian follicle. So, one of the primary follicle becomes the Graafian follicle. It matures, it undergoes changes and becomes the mature Graafian follicle, and that is a multicellular structure. So, this is closer to puberty, closer to adolescence. That is the first time one primary follicle develops into a Graafian follicle. From there, each month this cycle will continue. It reaches the peripheral area of the ovary. What is the peripheral area? I told you all, in the ovary there is the cortex and the medulla. Cortex is the outer region. In that also, towards the edge of the oval, towards the outer line of the ovary, that is the peripheral area of the ovary. So that is where the Graafian follicle becomes matured. And when matured, Graafian follicle bursts to release the ovum, which is directed towards the fallopian tube by fimbria. And this process is known as ovulation. You have to remember these terms, students. Ovulation. So we will be discussing the menstrual cycle. In that menstrual cycle, the 14th day will be the day the ovulation occurs. So that is when matured Graafian follicle bursts to release the ovum. So the Graafian follicle bursts to release the ovum, and that is directed towards the fallopian tube by fimbria. And that process is the bursting of the Graafian follicle to release the ovum is what we call as ovulation. Then the ovum passes through the fallopian tube towards the uterus. So as I said, the ovum will pass through the fallopian tube towards the uterus, whereas the sperms will enter the vagina, and there they will be traveling towards the fallopian tube. So there the sperm will meet the ovum and fertilization can take place. So that is the function of the female reproductive system in general. But we will have to discuss this function in more detail, where we look at the menstrual cycle. So before we go to the menstrual cycle, this is again a cross section of an ovary with various stages of ovum. So as I told you all, ovum is the egg, the female gamete cell of man. So there you can see the small sac-like structures. Here you can see, students. Now here this part, middle part is the medulla. The outer region is the cortex, and there also you can see. Now the primary follicles are here. These are the primary follicles. Primary follicles. Then after adolescence, during each cycle, one primary follicle undergoes changes. Here you can see it's a little larger, more larger. At this point, it has become more larger, and there we call it the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle. Then you can see at this point, now here and here, it has been pushed to the edge of the ovary. That is what we said as periphery of the ovary. So here this is a very well matured Graafian follicle. So as I told you all, this will be on the 14th day. So, on the 14th day, here you can see the mature Graafian follicle burst and the ova is released. So, this is the released ovum. Released ovum. Because it's only one ovum. Released ovum. So, after the ovum is released, this burst Graafian follicle undergoes changes, and here you can see this yellowish color structure that is known as the developing corpus luteum. And here you can see it has become the corpus luteum. So, this is the developing corpus luteum. So, this corpus luteum becomes smaller and smaller, then we call it the corpus albicans. So, here you can see this is the corpus albicans. And this corpus albicans becomes faded. It gets faded after some time. So, the primary follicles are there. The primary follicles develop to form the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle matures. Then it releases the ovum, and that is what we call as ovulation. Thereafter, the Graafian follicle develops into a corpus luteum. It becomes the corpus luteum here. Corpus luteum. And then the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans. So, this is a cyclic process occurring every month after adolescence until menopause in a mature female. Is that clear to you all? So, with that introduction, students, I will move on to the next slide where we discuss the menstrual cycle and the changes taking place in the ovary and the uterus in more detail. Activities of female reproductive system. So, I told you all there are different activities and there are two main structures, the uterus and the ovary. So, developing ova, which are the female reproductive cells, where does that take place? It occurs in the ovary. And after that, if this ova gets fertilized by the sperm, then it becomes the embryo and thereafter develops into the fetus. So, this development of fetus that occurs inside the uterus. So, facilitate the developing of fetus that will happen inside the uterus. And also production of hormones. There are two hormones. Again, they are lipid hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Lipid, or what we call as steroid hormones. So, production of hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that is also by ovaries. Ovary secretes the hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and both these are lipid hormones. So, three main functions. Developing ova, which are the female reproductive cells, that is done by the ovaries or that occurs inside the ovaries. Then facilitating the developing of fetus that occurs inside the uterus, and production of hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that again takes place inside the ovaries, or the ovaries act as glands that produce these hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So, with that, I will move on to the next slide. The menstrual cycle. So, as I told you all students, initially when the female child is born itself, in the fetal stage itself, the primary follicles are developed. So, after childbirth, until adolescence, the child grows, and when there is adolescence, the sexual maturity takes place, and thereafter the menstrual cycle starts. So, the primary follicle develops into the Graafian follicle, and when it becomes the mature Graafian follicle, it bursts and the ovum is released. So, thereafter there are some more changes taking place in the ovary as well as the uterus. altogether takes about 28 days. So, this acts as a cycle of 28 days until the menopause of female. That is where the cycle stops. So, the cyclic process, it is a cyclic process, that's important, associated with the reproductive system of sexually matured females, that is after adolescence or puberty. Sexually matured females is known as menstrual cycle. So, that is how you can explain what a menstrual cycle is. It takes approximately 28 days. This is very important. Normally, it is a 28-day cycle. If it's a very healthy female, it will occur every 28 days. But normally, the number of days can slightly vary. It can be 29 or 30 days. That's why we say it takes approximately 28 days for one menstrual cycle. Here, the pair of ovaries release the egg cells or ova alternately. That's very important. The ovaries release the egg cells alternately. So, in 1 month, if it is the left ovary, then the next month it will be the right ovary that will be releasing the ova. So, it will occur alternately, or the ovaries will function alternately. The whole process of menstrual cycle takes place associated with the two locations. What are the two locations? The ovary and the uterus. So, here we can consider it under the changes that take place in the ovary and the changes that take place in the uterus. So, there are two places where the changes take place. The changes that take place in the ovary and the changes that take place in the uterus. So, we will discuss that one by one. Changes that take place in the ovary. Development and release of ova, which are the female reproductive cells, is the function of ovaries. So, very important. Development and release of ova. That is one main function of ovary. There is another function, ovary secretes hormones. I told you all that before. So, inside the ovary, this development and release of ova occurs in two stages. So, the 28-day cycle can be divided into two stages. Changes that occur in the ovary can be divided into two stages. And the stages are called follicular phase and the luteal phase. Changes that occur in the ovary can be divided into two stages, follicular phase and luteal phase, or follicular stage and luteal stage. So, follicular phase will take place from day 1 to day 14, whereas the luteal phase will occur from day 15 to day 28. And you all know on the 14th day, it is the ovulation process. So, normally the first day of cycle, that is the menstrual cycle, is the day that the first day of menstruation occurs. Normally in females, there is menstruation taking place. The first day of that is considered as the first day of the menstrual cycle. So, here within the ovary, there will be two phases taking place. We will discuss that now. So, if you look at this diagram, here you can see, students, now day 0 to day 14, it's labeled as follicular phase. And then we have the luteal phase. So, there you can see initially it is the hormones that are shown to you. There you can see luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone is labeled as LH and follicle stimulating hormone, that is labeled or abbreviated as FSH. So, this LH and FSH are produced by the or secreted by the pituitary gland. LH and FSH both are secreted by the pituitary gland. So, they actually control the menstrual cycle. So, here you can see, students, this is the way it occurs. Students, there is a mistake here. The luteinizing hormone, it has to be written as luteinizing, or it can be spelled as luteinizing hormone. So, here it has to be L-U-T-E, there should be an I, N-I, it can be S-I-N-G or Z-I-N-G, luteinizing hormone. And follicle stimulating hormone, as I told you all, students, both LS and FSH, they are both secreted by the pituitary gland, that is part of the endocrine system that is present in the brain. So, the pituitary gland is present in the brain. Then you can see here the green color curve, that is the follicle stimulating hormone. From the name, you all can get an idea. The follicle, primary follicles develop to form the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle matures and bursts open, releasing the ovum. So, that happens from the first day to the 14th day. So, here you can see the green color curve, that is follicle stimulating hormone is more there. The concentration is more there. So, that actually initiates or controls the development of the primary follicle to the mature Graafian follicle. At that time, if you look at this blue color curve, that is the luteinizing hormone, that is less in concentration. But on the 14th day or just before the 14th day, you can see, students, the LH increases drastically. You can see the FSH also increasing, but the increasing in LH is very prominent. So, luteinizing hormone initiates the ovulation process. So, on the 14th day, here you can see the primary follicle becoming larger. Then you get the Graafian follicle. The Graafian follicle becomes matured, and then on the 14th day, it bursts open, releasing the ova. So, that process is the ovulation process. For that, the luteinizing hormone is very, very important. Thereafter, both the concentrations or levels of LH and FSH drop in the bloodstream, but still, the burst Graafian follicle develops into the corpus luteum, and then it becomes smaller and smaller gradually, where it becomes corpus albicans, and finally the corpus albicans fades off. It fades off. So, that again takes another 14 days. So, as I told you all, the first day of menstruation is day 1. Thereafter, these are the changes taking place inside the ovary. So, there are two hormones, LH and FSH. Both are secreted by the pituitary gland in the brain. And here you can see initially it is the FSH that actually stimulates or controls the development of primary follicle to the Graafian follicle. And on the 14th day, the LH, luteinizing hormone, increases, and that stimulates the ovulation process. So, their ovum is released. Thereafter, both the hormone levels drop in the bloodstream, but still the burst Graafian follicle develops into corpus luteum, and thereafter corpus albicans, and finally the corpus albicans fades off. And that takes another 14 days. And that process is what we call as luteal phase. So, we have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. These are the changes that take place in the ovary. So, with that, I will move on to the next slide. So, follicular phase, what I explained to you all before. This is the initial phase. You can see the diagram also here, students. Under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone FSH secreted by pituitary, a primary follicle in the ovary develops to form a Graafian follicle which is ready to release an ovum. So, if you look at the picture, students, you all can see the primary follicle develops to form the Graafian follicle which is ready to release the ovum. And this takes about 14 days. And during this time, the ovary also secretes a hormone. It secretes estrogen. And you all know estrogen is a lipid hormone. During this phase, ovary secretes estrogen. That is very important. Now, this estrogen actually is responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics in females. And also during this cycle, the menstrual cycle, estrogen is secreted by the ovary during the follicular phase. So, that actually acts on the uterus. We will discuss those phases after this. So, here you can see, students, the follicular phase is from day 0 to day 40. Then we will move on to the next phase, that is the luteal phase. This is the final phase. So, actually there are two phases. Initial phase is follicular phase, second one is luteal phase. When Graafian follicle is mature, it bursts and the ovum inside it is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube under the influence of luteinizing hormone, that is LH, secreted by pituitary gland. So, this is something that you need to remember, students. The Graafian follicle is matured. So, at this stage you can see the Graafian follicle is matured and it bursts open. So, here it bursts open and releases the ovum and it released from the ovary into the fallopian tube. So, you can remember I told you all the fimbria, finger-like projections of the fallopian tube. At the ends, it's like a funnel-like structure. When the fimbria move, due to the movement, ovum is directed into the fallopian tube and through that it travels towards the uterus. So, this is influenced by the luteinizing hormone LH that is secreted by the pituitary gland. If fertilization does not occur, so that is if the egg or the ovum is not fertilized by the sperm, when the ovum is passing forward through the fallopian tube. So, fertilization takes place within the fallopian tube. You all can remember, students, the ovum is moving from the fimbria towards the uterus, whereas the sperm will move from the uterus towards the fallopian tube, towards the fimbria end of the fallopian tube. So, they are within the fallopian tube. Normally, fertilization takes place. So, if fertilization does not occur when the ovum is passing forward through fallopian tube, the remaining part of Graafian follicle changes to form corpus luteum and finally to corpus albicans and fades off. So, this is if there is no fertilization. Then it will change like that. This whole process occurs during the luteal phase and it takes about 14 days. So, here the cycle has two phases, both are 14-day phases. So, it takes 14 days. During this phase, ovary secretes progesterone, that is another hormone. Again, I told you all, students, both estrogen and progesterone, they are both lipid hormones. Now, this progesterone is actually involved with the development of the fetus inside the uterus. So, that is if fertilization takes place. So, estrogen is secreted during the follicular phase. That is again secreted by the ovary, a lipid hormone. Then during the luteal phase, it is the progesterone, that is also a lipid hormone secreted by the ovary. So, this is what happens there. Ovulation takes place, then the Graafian follicle becomes corpus luteum and then it gets converted to corpus albicans and finally the corpus albicans fades off. So, those are the changes that take place within the ovary. Then I will move on to the next slide. Changes that take place in the uterus. So, similar to the ovary, there are changes taking place in the uterus. But this takes place in 3 stages. So, if an ovum is fertilized, the embryo develops in the uterus. That you can remember. Uterus is what we normally call as womb. So, if there is fertilization, the embryo will develop in the uterus. Embryo develops in the uterus. If an ovum is not fertilized, so that is another possibility. The ovum can get fertilized, then the embryo will develop in the uterus. If it is not fertilized only, the menstrual cycle will continue. Changes that occur in uterus are divided into 3 phases. So, if the ovum was fertilized by the sperm, then of course it will become the embryo and the fetus will develop inside the uterus. There it is a set of changes occurring inside the uterus. But if fertilization doesn't occur, then of course there will be 3 phases taking place inside the uterus. That is part of the menstrual cycle. So, if an ovum is not fertilized, changes that occur in uterus are divided into 3 phases. So, the first phase is the menstrual phase. Menstrual phase. Then we have the proliferation phase. And finally, we have the secretory phase. So, we have the menstrual phase, proliferation phase and secretory phase. We will discuss these 3 phases now. So, here again you can look at the diagram, students. Now, this is the wall of the ovary. So, I told you all inside there is a lumen and there are walls. Now, the fundus part, it's like a triangular shape. So, top part is the fungus and there are the side walls. All the walls undergo this change. So, here you can see the first day of the menstrual cycle. Here it is the menstrual phase. Then we have the proliferation phase and finally we have the secretory phase. So, here you can see the number of days are different. The menstrual phase is usually for 4 days, but that again depends on the female. Normally for a very healthy female, we consider it as 4 days, but sometimes it can even go up to 7 days or more. So, here menstrual phase, the ovary wall is actually expelled out because the egg did not get fertilized. So, there is no embryo, there is no development of the fetus. Initially, the uterus was actually expecting to facilitate the growth of the embryo. But now that there is no fertilization, the wall of the uterus will be expelled out with blood. That is what we call as menstruation. So, the first day of the menstrual cycle is with the expelling of the ovary wall. That happens for first 4 days. Then after that, what happens? Again the ovary gets prepared to develop the fetus. So, again you can see the next phase, that is the proliferation phase, the ovary wall is developing. So, that occurs for about 10 days. First 4 days menstrual phase, then the proliferation phase for about 10 days and thereafter you can see here the next 14 days the ovary wall becomes very highly vascularized and also it's almost like a swelled and all well developed with lot of blood supply and lot of secretions. That is why we call it as the secretory phase. Now it is well developed to facilitate the growth of a fetus. So, those are the 3 stages or 3 phases occurring inside the uterus. So, this is how the ovary wall changes. So, again, at the end of 28 days, if there is no fertilization, again you can see the ovary wall will be expelled out. So, again the menstrual cycle will start. Otherwise, if the ovum gets fertilized, then of course this change will not take place again. There will be the development of the fetus. So during this phase also, there are two hormones. The hormones that were secreted by the ovary. What are they? The two lipid hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now look at the graphs. Initially you can see the yellow color graph, that is the estrogen hormone. So that is mainly involved with the preparation of the ovary wall in order to facilitate the development of fetus. So here you can see estrogen is initially high up to the 14th day. So on the 14th day, what happens? The ovulation process. So until then, you can see the concentration of estrogen in blood is high. Then it drops. But at the same time, if you look at this blue color curve, that is progesterone, initially it is low. Up to here, it is low. But once ovulation takes place, you can see the amount of progesterone increases as well as the amount of estrogen also increases. That is during the secretory phase where the uterus wall is well developed to facilitate the development of the fetus. So that is how the hormones change. This is the change taking place in the wall of the uterus. These are the two hormones that are secreted by the ovary. So you can remember during the follicular phase, it is estrogen that is secreted, and during the luteal phase only the progesterone is secreted. So this is during the follicular phase. Follicular phase. And this is during the luteal phase. That is taking place inside the ovary, just for you all to relate the two phases because it's the same cycle. But in two locations, the changes are taking place. So not only these changes, there is a change in the temperature of a female body as well during this process. So now I have explained the three phases that take place inside the uterus. We will discuss them one by one. The first phase, menstrual phase. This is the initial phase. So if fertilization does not take place, level of progesterone decreases. So if fertilization does not take place, level of progesterone decreases. So as you know, progesterone helps to develop the fetus. So if there is no fetus, the progesterone decreases. This causes the degradation of wall of the uterus, and it is expelled out from the body through vagina with blood. So the expelling of the wall of the uterus, that is the first day of the menstrual cycle. This is referred to as menstrual flow. So expelling of the uterus wall with blood is what we call as menstrual flow. It occurs for about 4 days. So again, I told you all students, depending on the health of the female body or the person, this can vary slightly. But normally, according to the menstrual cycle, we consider it as 4 days. So the first 4 days is the menstrual phase. And during that, the progesterone level drops, but the estrogen level starts increasing. Both the hormones are secreted by the ovary. You can remember that. Then we will move on to the next phase, that is the proliferation phase. This is the second phase. So here you can see the second phase. Degraded wall of uterus starts to rebuild because of the influence of estrogen. So now estrogen level is increasing, so the degraded wall is rebuilding. Again the next cycle is taking place. So it's preparing to facilitate the growth of the fetus. New cell layer and blood capillaries grow on the inner wall of the uterus. So new cell layer, blood capillaries, they grow on the inner wall of the uterus. So the embryo can get embedded or implanted in the wall of the uterus. It takes about 10 days for this process. So first 4 days menstrual cycle. So their menstrual flow takes place. The next 10 days proliferation phase where the rebuilding of the uterus takes place. And thereafter what is the phase? It's going to be the secretory phase. So here we have the secretory phase. This is the final phase. The uterine wall thickens and blood supply also increases. So I told you all uterine wall thickens and blood supply increases. Now it is well developed to facilitate the growth of the fetus. Glands on the uterine wall are active and it becomes secretory. So there are glands on the uterine wall. They secrete substances. So the wall of the uterus is secretory and it is all well developed and it becomes very thick and there is lot of blood supply. This happens because of the influence of hormone progesterone. So the hormone is progesterone and it takes about 14 days for this process to happen. So while inside the ovary, the luteal phase is taking place, inside the uterus, it is going to be the secretory phase. They all occur parallelly or simultaneously, we can say. Because the menstrual cycle is a 28-day cycle. All the changes take place parallelly in the uterus as well as the ovaries. The body temperature also increases slightly during this period. This is what we normally call as the hot flash. During the menstrual cycle, before the menstrual flow, there is an increase in body temperature. Now we will look at that graph. So this is the changes of body temperature during menstrual cycle. So here you can see, students, normally what is the temperature? It's between 36 and 37 degrees Celsius. So there you can see it is closer to 36 degrees Celsius normally. So the first 4 days, it is the menstrual phase. Then we have the proliferation phase from day 4 to day 14. Proliferation phase. So during that time, you can see only there is a gradual increase in temperature. But after the 14th day, that is after ovulation, during the secretory phase. So this is the secretory phase. During the secretory phase, from day 14 to 28, you can see the temperature is somewhat high. That is what we normally call as hot flash. So there, after day 28, again the menstrual cycle starts. The menstrual phase starts. So there again the temperature drops. So this is how it happens. 0 to 14 days, the temperature is somewhat low. 14th day, ovulation takes place. After that, it is the secretory phase taking place inside the uterus. And inside the ovaries, it is the luteal phase. So during that time, the temperature is somewhat higher. So in the uterus, it is the secretory phase. And inside the ovary, it is going to be the luteal phase. So parallelly, all the changes are taking place. Is that clear to you all, students? So up to here is the menstrual cycle. Now during the menstrual cycle, on the 14th day, ovum is released. What do we call that process? Ovulation. Bursting of the Graafian follicle and releasing of the mature ovum. And ovum is directed into the fallopian tube with the movement of the fimbria, and it will be traveling through the fallopian tube. At the same time, if the sperm has entered the vagina, that will travel towards the fallopian tube, and inside the fallopian tube, they will both meet and fertilization will take place. If fertilization takes place, then the fertilized ovum becomes the embryo, and that will get implanted inside the uterus, and thereafter the fetus will develop. That change will take place for 10 months. So after this, we will be discussing the process that occurs during fertilization and the development of the fetus inside the uterus. So with that students, I will end this chapter, and in the next chapter, I will discuss the process of fertilization and the development of embryo as well as the diseases related to the reproductive system.